This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode, I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 18 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about cultural fusion and confusion. So a whole lot of talk about how we deal with cultural differences when we travel, how sometimes we deal with them quite well and sometimes we don't, and the kind of assumptions that we take with us from our own cultures and all kinds of cultural stuff. But before we get to our guests, I want to give a quick shout out to a couple of lovely listeners who've left some really lovely reviews about the Thoughtful Travel Podcast on iTunes. Not to toot my own horn, but to toot the horns of my guests, in fact, because they mention the stories that the guests tell as being really the key to why they've enjoyed the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. So a quick shout out, first of all, to Sally, who said that she was enjoying this series from me and my guests, and that they're extraordinary stories from everyday people, which I think is a really nice way to put it. And also a big thank you to Audrey, who left a lovely review, which included this bit. There are laughable, heartfelt, and sometimes uneasy moments shared on this podcast that show to the listener that things more often turn out for the best. And if nothing else, travel experiences give you great stories to share. Thanks, Audrey, and that's exactly what I'm trying to prove with this podcast, and I think you've really captured that well. Thanks so much, both of you, for those reviews. And to all of you other lovely listeners, please feel free to hop over to iTunes and rate and review the podcast when you have a moment. It really helps to share it with a wider audience, which of course is a great thing for all of us, I hope. So on to our topic of cultural fusion and confusion. And I think nothing is more fascinating to me when we travel than the cultural clashes, the things we discover that are just so different from home, things we might have expected before we arrived in a new country, and particularly the things that we didn't expect. And a lot of that comes about from the assumptions that we've made, both about what will be different and what won't be different. And our first guest today, Annalicia Lynn, talks about that quite well, I think. She moved to Taiwan from the US to teach for a year and really had more trouble dealing with the sort of the everyday cultural differences, the stuff you don't expect, particularly in the workplace and in other sort of normal appearing situations. So I'll let her tell you about some of the cultural confusion she experienced moving to Taiwan.
You know, for me, I think it was very interesting to become aware of the assumptions I had, or I do have, going into any experience where you're interacting with a different culture. So the story that's coming to mind is when we first arrived in Taiwan, I assumed, because I come from America, right? And we're very direct and we're very goal oriented. And we also, so in order to allocate money for something, we have to have a plan for it. Right. So I assumed when I showed up in Taiwan, because they had allocated so much money for my salary and all these different things, that they knew exactly what I would be doing. And I also thought if they didn't, they would tell me that. And so the first 2 to 3 weeks at school were very difficult for me. I mean, they were still wonderful, but I was very confused. Right. Because I didn't know what I should be doing, but no one could tell me why or when I would know what I should be doing. And then I thought maybe I was doing something wrong because, you know, I was one of those girls in the States who, you know, got good grades and that kind of thing. So yep. I could follow people's rules, right? But I didn't know what the rules were.
That makes it tricky.
Right? I know. So I remember like sitting at my desk and just being like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing to fill my time right now. And granted, this was before school had actually started, so the kids weren't there yet and whatnot. But I wanted to be helpful. I wanted to be of service, so to speak, but I really didn't know what to do. So that, I feel like that was probably the most difficult time. And, now looking back, I understand very clearly that it was just a cultural difference. I assumed they knew what I was to be doing, and I either missed it or they weren't telling me. And what was really going on was they were kind of coming up with my role as they went along. And because they're not quite as direct as my culture in America, they couldn't just outright say, like, we don't know what you're going to be doing yet. So they would give me different answers that would kind of just leave me feeling very confused. And now, of course, I can look back at it and just smile. Neither culture is right or wrong. I just went in with an assumption that this is just how it goes, so to speak. And what was really happening was kind of those assumptions were crumbling. And I was realizing that there's a lot of ways to create something, right? Like my position. And it's not always best. I can really respect the way they do it now because they got to know me, and it kind of was a gradual process.
Right.
That was really beautiful. And I think, if I were to do it again, so to speak, I would be a lot more comfortable with that just because I would understand what was going on. But at that time, it was very uncomfortable for me because I was really unclear about it. But the good thing was, after that experience, I then had a better understanding of that's how they work. So I could see that playing out in a lot of different things throughout the year that I was there. And it just gave me a lot more, I could just kind of sit back a little bit and let it unfold instead of trying to, direct it in a way that would have been inappropriate.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yes, it sounded like, although there was a cultural difference, you didn't turn it into kind of like a cultural clash or anything by kind of imposing your culture onto theirs or anything. You just went with the flow until it sort of sorted itself out.
Yeah, I did my best to do that. I may have vented out some frustrations to my husband.
That's okay.
Yeah,
that's allowed.
But in hindsight, yeah, I really can see it wasn't that either was right or wrong. I was just confused. And I could sense there was something going on culturally, but until you get to know the culture, it's kind of that, as I'm speaking this out, I'm realizing, like, when you first enter into a culture, there's this interesting period where you don't know it well enough, but you can feel when something is different. And so, like, I think that's probably the most, at least for me, uncomfortable period of time, when you have to get to know their tendencies while still knowing that, okay, something is not aligning with my culture. And that's not good or bad. It's just, it feels uncomfortable because I'm so used to a certain way of operating.
Yeah, exactly right. And it just takes a bit more time before it can become clear sometimes. But yeah.
It's so true.
Fascinating. Yes. It's interesting. I wouldn't have quite known what to expect either in Taiwan. Even now, having had, experience of other places nearby and knowing Taiwanese people, I wouldn't have quite known how they would work. So obviously I went to teach in Japan and it was quite different there again, but and different situation with like an enormous school where everything was very well regimented and organised, and
I have to say that I think that experience in particular, but also just, of course, all the big and small cultural differences, I think they were the most liberating thing to experience, because you start to realize that normal is truly a relative term.
Yes.
And that we really are making this all up as we go, because I went in thinking, like, it's obvious that my work will unfold this way because that's just how work works. You know what I mean? And to be in a situation where it unfolded so completely different than I could have ever imagined, and it was still good, but it just made me realize, my goodness, like, you can create your own rules because each cultural difference shows you that we just come up with agreements, right? Within the society we live about what's appropriate and what we want. Mm-hmm. And like I said, I just think, although it was uncomfortable, it was also really beautiful and extremely liberating.
Yeah, I never thought of it like that, but you're quite right. It kind of shows us that, so I guess somewhere in the world, all possible choices are being acted out. So
Yeah. Oh,
it doesn't matter. We don't have to stick to what our culture says is exactly the right way to do it. I could really relate to how Annalicia described the uncomfortable period of time she spent trying to figure out the cultural norms when she first started in her job in Taiwan. I don't think the same happened to me in Japan. I think I was fairly well prepared by the company I worked for. But surprisingly to me, it happened to me more when I moved to Germany. Germany was a really unusual place for me at first. In some respects, I was kind of disappointed that it was so much like home. I'd just spent a couple of years in Japan and a year in Slovakia, and both of these places were really different to Australia in so many different ways. And then I arrived in Germany, and a lot of it was really just the same as Australia, and I was kind of disappointed that it wasn't more different. And yet, the longer I spent there, the more differences I found. And certainly in my work situation, there was definitely what Annalicia described as this uncomfortable period of time trying to figure out these cultural norms there. For example, a lot of things really confused me about the relationships people would have with their colleagues. Here in Australia, we're extremely friendly with our colleagues. We always use first names when we speak to each other. We talk a lot about our private life. Everyone would know sort of the basics of who has kids and around how old they are, what people do on the weekends, all of these kind of, well, to me, very everyday things. But when I was teaching in Germany, I would have groups of colleagues together in the same room, and they had worked together for years. But when I, for example, referred to one of them by their first name, which was acceptable and what they expected in my English classes, they didn't know which of their colleagues I was talking about. And I always remember it was probably a couple of months in when we were talking about something we'd done on the weekend and kids and, normal everyday small talk at the beginning of our lesson. Well, I thought it was normal everyday small talk. And two of the managers in my class who had worked together for 5 or 6 years discovered that they had kids around the same age at the same school. And to me, it was unfathomable that they hadn't figured that out yet and that it took English class to work that out. But it was those kind of cultural norms that were confusing to me for quite some time. And they weren't the sort of thing that came up immediately if you Googled, cultural differences in Germany. I knew that they were more formal, but I didn't really expect that it was, well, quite as different as it was. So, but as Annalicia and I discussed, there's no right way to do it. It's just different. And I eventually adapted to that. But it was, there's a lot of interesting things going on there. So, interesting times. Now, my next guest today is Jeff Sandquist, who, as you might guess from his surname, although it hadn't occurred to me until we had this discussion, has some Scandinavian heritage. And he lives in Minnesota, where apparently there's quite a lot of Scandinavian heritage. And when he then travelled to the real Scandinavia, it was an interesting cultural experience for him.
And we're both of Scandinavian heritage, so it was, it's like, oh yeah, we should check out Norway and that whole area as well. So
yes, okay, now I recognize your surname has that Scandinavian look about it.
Yes, yeah. I'm mostly I'm mostly Swedish. There's also some and my wife is mostly like Norwegian.
Right.
So, and that's what you get around Minnesota here.
Oh, right. Oh, interesting. Oh, there you go. I'm boning up on my American geography. This is perfect.
And it was a really interesting experience going to Norway, especially because we've grown up with all these jokes about Sweden and Norway and all these different Scandinavian, like the stoicism and on and on. And going there actually made me more appreciative of my own heritage, as well as understand where I currently live and where I grew up. And it was interesting, especially because like I was looking around and seeing people and going, wow, they could be related to anyone in my wife's family at all. Like that looks like your sister, that looks like your dad. And just seeing the culture that is very prevalent in Minnesota, but obviously not 100%.
Yeah.
Really made us appreciate and understand not only where we grow up and live, but also some of our own family's behaviors as well.
I was really intrigued by Jeff's example of, well, what I term a cultural fusion. So this impact of the Scandinavian culture in the area around where he grew up and lives in the US, around Minnesota. I think that's kind of fascinating and really interesting to see his insight when he actually got to visit the real thing, that there was some common behaviours that had been mixing into the culture over in the US. Now, unfortunately, my next example is kind of the opposite. It's definitely a cultural confusion. And I had the chance to chat with Glenn Shiell from Snow Riders WA, who's a keen skier and has visited Japan a couple of times to ski, and unfortunately was able to tell me about some cultural clashes going on between particularly Australian ski tourists and the local Japanese in Hokkaido.
So there's quite a lot of Aussies in Niseko. It's, in fact, when you go there, it's kind of hard not to go anywhere without hearing Aussie accents and, seeing people in Carlton football jumpers or, West Coast Eagles.
Wow, that's weird in Japan.
Yeah, so, I really dislike it actually when I see someone in a West Coast Eagles jumper walking around in Japan. I just don't want to be reminded, A, I hate West Coast anyway, and B, I'm in Japan.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's really weird. And it's obviously not my experience of Japan from when I lived there, but yeah. Okay, gosh.
Well, that's
weird.
right. So this is little Australia on the island of Hokkaido, and it's kind of embarrassing because they've even had to make special local laws that are just for Niseko. Because in Japan they're pretty liberal with their bars, and the bars can stay open till, I don't know, I think they can stay open all night in some places. But in Niseko, they passed special laws that the bars have to close by 2 a.m. or something like that, because it was just getting way too out of hand. The Australians were just, being Australians, and
that's
getting
embarrassing.
drunk and stealing cars.
Oh, in Japan, there's no crime in Japan.
Exactly. So, that here in Australia, that's bad enough. But in Japan, that's just, that's shameful to go, stealing cars. Sort of. Yeah. So, the police were just sick of it. They were sick of the Australians, so they ended up passing special laws. And to be fair, it wasn't always just the Australians. There's lots of other international visitors as well. There's the Kiwis, there's more Europeans these days, North Americans, and an increasing number of people from Hong Kong and Thailand actually these days,
interesting.
Which is interesting. But yeah, so that's quite a new thing that you've got the people from Hong Kong coming in, and the Thais especially. But so it's been a real problem, and you see it all the time. The Japanese are just, they're so polite and they're so nice, and they, even if you offend them, which Australians, I'm sure some of these Australians are doing on a regular basis, they would never ever say anything. So, for example, people wearing their shoes inside when they're not supposed to be wearing shoes inside.
Oh, yes. Yeah. It's a hard and fast rule in Japan. There's no two ways about it. Oh, that's awful.
Yeah, so you're coming in at night drunk, with snow and all over their shoes, and then tramping through the house, and and then a little old lady, Japanese host, will come out with the mop and very politely just clean it all up behind you and not say anything. Yet she's clearly absolutely mortified.
Of course.
Yeah.
Wow.
And just a very ordered society over there, very polite, and just getting on and off buses and that sort of thing. We just found that there were some Australians that were quite intolerant of that, shouting at the driver to open the back door of the bus because, it was crowded and we had to wait. But the reality is that the system is that everybody has to pass single file past the driver and have their ticket checked.
Yeah, exactly.
What happens.
That's, yes.
But some of the others that were visitors just decided that they didn't want to do that, and they should just be let out the back because they were the onsens as well. I mean, they're a very traditional place, almost like a sacred place to go. Yeah, and there's there's the whole ritual around the onsens where there's
a lot of etiquette about washing first and all of that stuff, isn't there?
That's right. Yeah. So, you go in, you put your clothes in the locker and you wash yourself down first, and you only have a little hanky thing to cover up parts, and you've got to go out to the. But so it sort of extends there as well. So you'll find that in Bali it might be okay to drink beer in the spa, but it's certainly not okay to drink beer in the onsens.
No.
Yeah. So.
Sure. Oh, I'm feeling really embarrassed as an Australian right now.
Yeah, it's a funny place though, Niseko. Even though you find it is a bit embarrassing, and the Australians are breaking the rules left, right, and centre. The Japanese never say anything, so they'd be, they're not confrontational at all.
No.
And B, it's funny because there's kind of a little bit of acceptance because the Australians bring so much money to this. So, a lot of the livelihoods, a lot of these people are farmers, because it's actually a farming area.
Right, okay.
Out where these resorts are, and they're mainly potato farmers and dairy farmers and that sort of thing. So the fact that they can run restaurants or onsens in the winter in these resorts probably actually brings them a fairly good income relative to what they would get. Yeah, so I think there's a little bit of tolerance on behalf of the Japanese, but, I still think it's no excuse. I still think sitting in a foreign country, you should be able to learn a little bit about the customs and, try and at least respect them while you're there. And I think it's just common sense.
Well, you could probably hear in my conversation with Glenn that I'm more than slightly outraged to imagine these bunches of drunken Aussies going crazy in beautiful Japan. Japan is a country very dear to my heart after I lived there for a couple of years, and I found it so welcoming and so, just such a lovely society. And it really distresses me to imagine these Aussies up there really taking advantage of the local mindset of the Japanese endeavour to please and to be polite and not to create conflict, and the fact that they've had to introduce special local laws to deal with the drunken behaviour upsets me no end. And I hope that there's something done to improve the situation. Glenn, for one, is doing his bit. He has a post on his blog called 8 Sure Tips to Avoid Being a Bogan in Japan This Winter, which I will share in the show notes. And if you're not an Aussie and don't know what a bogan is, well, message me and ask me and I'll tell you. To me, this whole issue of the Aussies going crazy in Japan reminds me too much of Bali. And I've only been to Bali once, and I wasn't able to get very far beyond the main tourist zones, but just the fact that those main tourist zones are so vast and so full of Australians who probably are not being that respectful of the local culture, and so many other things that I could rave on about, but I'll try and keep it brief. To imagine that kind of atmosphere being transferred to Japan was really distressing. If you're interested, I'll leave a link in the show notes to my post about whether I think experienced travellers who haven't been there should go to Bali or not. You can probably guess my opinion. I think there's probably other places in the world that I would go first. Anywhere else in Indonesia for a start. So I didn't get to Bali until I was, nearly 40. And for Perth people, it's just the local place. It's actually cheaper to go to Bali than to go to anywhere else in Australia. So it's really a place that people go regularly, but sadly, I think, without too much respect for the culture. But anyway, that's just one of the issues of cultural fusion and cultural confusion. So I hope I've given you something to think about today, and as have our 3 lovely guests. So I'll just give a quick shout out to them so you know where to find them online if you want to chase them up a bit further. So first up today we had Annalicia Lynn of Yoga and Pilates Online, which is yogaandpilatesonline.com. Easy to find, Annalicia. Then I had Jeff from Intentional Wandering. So here you can find him at intentionalwandering.com, and his Intentionally Wandering podcast as well is on iTunes and really worth a listen. And last but definitely not least, Glenn Shiell of Snow Riders Western Australia. He's at snowriderswa.com, has a great Facebook community at facebook.com/snowriderswa as well. thank you very much for taking the time to listen to episode 18 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you could leave a rating or a review on iTunes, I would be so grateful. Thank you in advance. You can tweet me at Amanda Kendall and use the Thoughtful Travel Pod hashtag. And if you prefer Facebook, then do look up Not a Ballerina on Facebook and you can message me there. Thanks so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.
Jackrabbit FM. For your ears.
Who is that? Hi, podcast.